So hi, everyone. I'm AJ from ProWritingAid, and thanks for joining for another session of Writing for Effective Leadership, a series that we hold on the third Wednesday of every month. I've spent over 10 years designing and teaching undergraduate and MBA level writing and communication courses. And in these webinars, I bring that experience and into a discussion about how exceptional writing and communication can boost your business, studies, or career in a practical way. So next month, we will have, we'll continue our effective leadership series, and we'll be talking specifically about persuasion and how the theory or the strategy of framing and empathy and understanding can help you move clients, colleagues, and employees to action. And so today, my guest is Daniel Dus. Daniel is known best for his work in the solar industry, where he joined 15 years ago. And since then, he has helped grow some of the largest solar companies in the world, including Martifer Solar, where I met Daniel, which was one of the largest players in the US from 2009 to 2012. He then went to Safari Energy, the #1 provider of solar to real estate investment trusts in the United States. And then most recently, he's at Asani Solar, which is now the largest solar company in the world, where Daniel leads the US business. He also sits on the board of iSun, one of the largest publicly traded commercial solar companies. And in his spare time, which I don't really understand how Daniel has spare time, but he says that in his spare time, he has also built a carbon neutral real estate development business. Daniel, thanks so much for being here.
Andrew, my pleasure. And first of all, can we just address the fact that we are talking about effective communication while, of course, communicating right now. And, you know, more than any other talk that I've been on, I feel like under the microscope. And it made me wonder how I can't imagine how you do this when you're training business leaders in effective communication every day. Don't you feel like the bar is set pretty high every time you walk in front of a class or speak to a class? Like, what is that like?
It's fun. It's funny that you say that. So it makes me think of two things. One is 6 or 7 years ago, I was designing an MBA writing course for a university, and they had told me that there was another professor who had designed a speaking course. And she said that this professor had designed this speaking course, and he had about 800 slides, and that the students didn't enjoy it. And the funny thing about it is, I imagine one of those slides said, "Know your audience." Right, and know how your audience is doing. And so while he's on his 500 slide or something like that, so it is fully meta. It is quite meta. And then the other thing I think is partly I want to demystify good communication and speaking, and saying, it's not about always being just perfect or totally polished. And if you look at a lot of the world's best leaders, there's this thing, kind of an emphasis on authenticity and being real. And I think people connect with that. So yes, you are right. But I do feel like I need to be a clear thinker and a good communicator. And at the same time, I'm allowed to just model, ideally, I don't know, like the kinds of, and I'm always trying to get better too. So that's a long answer to a cool question. What's your take?
It just takes a lot of confidence on your part. You are your representation in real time. That's a bar. So
okay,
fascinating.
Cool. Yeah, Daniel, you've held a lot of leadership roles in solar and the renewables. So tell us a little bit. What's your view of leadership? How do you think about it?
Yeah, leadership for me really breaks down into two buckets. And I'll try and tie these together in the themes that we're talking about here today, namely storytelling and communication. But the first bucket is kind of philosophical or strategic. This is the soft skills. And the other bucket is more process and tactical. And I would argue that communication and storytelling is kind of the thread that combines these two buckets. That makes sense.
Yeah, so absolutely.
The sort of philosophical, just to dig in a little bit, the philosophical strategic bucket, this is where things like transparency within an organization live. I, for example, make virtually all company information available to all management to ensure consistent communication of this information across the group and across the teams. This is one of the few things I actually micromanage, things like naming conventions of documents to make sure they're readily digestible, findable, etc., and to really enhance and enable communication across the team so that everyone knows how to rapidly find information, all so that they can communicate easier, right? I think another piece of this bucket is kind of honesty, trust, and transparency, which should never be undervalued, I think. Without it, you have very little, including your own dignity. And so, and how else do you build trust other than communicating, right? And then following through on your commitments and your representations. And so, again, kind of the meaningfulness and impact of communication and strategy is hard to exaggerate. I think positivity falls in this bucket as well. Building and maintaining a positive work environment is just ultra critical. Every organization faces challenges, and it's really hope, positivity, belief in the ability of your teams to get through these challenges that gets you through them to find the right solutions without destroying company culture. And what is positivity if it's not a story, if it's not a method or a context? This is what positivity really is. It's the way that you interact with your team, the way they interact and communicate with each other. And I feel like in an organization, it has to be selfishly guarded, right, and protected. Really super hypercritical. And that kind of brings me to another item that I think is extremely important, which is building safe spaces. Building safe spaces is really important to me, probably among the most important elements of team building and organizational success. Safe spaces promote the free flow of communication, creativity, they engender boldness, and kind of like newsflash, but your organization's best ideas don't always come out of your own head, right? They don't even come out of your sort of top brass's heads. They come from the trenches, right? And these are the folks that if they don't feel empowered to communicate, they will not communicate. They'll stop communicating, and those ideas get lost. I think a unidirectional top-down communication culture is bound to failure, right? Especially in the age of rapid change. And there's a, frankly, an inherent kind of power dynamic in the employee-boss relationship, which can be a powerful tool, but it can also be a huge pitfall for communication, especially within an organization. If an employee doesn't feel comfortable enough to contribute and communicate and raise new ideas, then they won't do that. So, we've all heard about unhealthy and unproductive male-female dynamics in business over the last 5 years, especially, or simply just A-type personalities versus other personalities that may be less likely to kind of speak up, right? I credit the women in my life for really challenging me to understand how hard it is and how important it is to build and maintain these safe spaces as a leader, specifically to maintain and engender communication. If you as a leader don't do that specifically, then who else really would or could? So super critical, I think, element of leadership. I think establishing how you make or lead your market, this is really your strategy, your market strategy. And this is in this bucket, and it has to include ample communication across your teams. A top-down, bottom-up approach, and one that is really iterative, that solicits collective organizational feedback, that's your organizational intelligence, is critical in crystallizing your strategy. Because if you don't kind of engender this buy-in, then you're leaving so much readily available data unconsidered and often your best data. And so as a leader, if you aren't collecting that feedback, you're failing yourself and your team, and your team doesn't know it, right? Like they know exactly how valuable their knowledge is. If you're in a business and you're setting strategy or deciding on markets based on things like headlines in trade magazines, you're usually too late. Versus on the contrary, if you're collecting reviewing, analyzing organizational data, then you see the market evolve in real time, right? And you're more readily able to predict its direction and be ahead of the market or create the market. And that's really what drives value. So, how does storytelling fit in? I think it's really the linchpin of many of these kind of core concepts. Humanity, after all, right, is an oral tradition for hundreds of thousands of years. It's how we communicated. And written word is kind of a recent bolt-on to that tradition. PowerPoint is what was like 1990 or something. So every one of these soft skills really should or needs to be incorporated into a story. The business itself, frankly, is a story, right? How else do you communicate to your clients, your financiers, your suppliers, your team? That is all story. So,
well, what you've illustrated, which I think is really cool, is that even when I think of leadership and communication, I perhaps think narrowly about the speeches that the leader is giving, even the interpersonal communication or the emails. But what you've opened up, which I think is really cool, is the idea that you as the leader can set the tone for communication in the company as a fundamental element of culture, right? So your example of I want everyone to have access to all of our documents and everything. I hadn't thought about that as part of a leader's communication strategy. And so it's like your approach, which you've made me think of, is that you are going to create a particular kind of environment, and that and a communicative environment, and that's going to shape not just how you speak but how others do. It seems like that's what's going on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. For example, in building a safe space, you have to specifically elicit feedback from folks who may be inclined or less inclined to offer that feedback, their ideas and concepts. And if you as the leader don't do that, then your team leaders won't necessarily do that. And again, because of the way power dynamics flow in society, which is rather hierarchical often, and especially organizations which are have an entrenched hierarchy, then who's left to do it but you, right? So it makes it one of the unique sort of aspects of leadership that only a leader can ensure that that's happening. And so
I want to go back to what you said about telling stories to different stakeholders like financiers and investors. And I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit because I'm interested. I'm assuming you sometimes speak to potential investors that don't understand solar.
Oh yeah.
And so my question to you is, or I mean, I think probably 80% of us, 90% of us on this webinar right now have a minimal knowledge of solar and where the industry is, where it was, and where it's headed. What's the story that you tell to people about solar? Maybe we'll take investors, for example. What story do you tell them about solar and how to think about it, or what's your strategy?
Yeah, no, it is hypercritical. Communication in renewables has been especially important because it is a brand new technology fundamentally to most of our customers, our financiers, our regulators, even many building departments, suppliers. Our teams, just as you joined Martifer from a different related industry, are new to the industry, which is great. Right. This is what helps us grow. And so the stakeholders in our industry in renewables, what we've been doing the last 15, 20 years is educating these stakeholders about the technology, how it works, how it flows through to financial models, risks associated with it. And that is absolutely fundamental to how we've grown the industry. Without it, right, we would not be able to have grown the way we have. Solar, when we worked together, I think the entire annual US industry was about 150 or so megawatts installed that year. That's about 0.01% of what we'll install this year. It's
unbelievable.
Yeah. multiple orders of magnitude. And so in the process, you have to bring your stakeholders along with you and educate them. Personally, what I did when I first entered renewables around 2006 was I found a project that was in construction, which at the time was not easy to do because there were so few of them. I found the contractor who was doing the work, and I called and I asked if I could do manual labor on this project. And the contractor said, like, no, we're good. We have our team. You've never done this before. And I said, no, I want to volunteer my time to carry panels around, to hang inverters, to pull wire, to see the commissioning process of a solar project. And they thought I was crazy, but they invited me to come on over. And the next thing that I did after that was became a certified solar designer, so that I could do things like single line diagrams, run wire sizing calculations, not because I planned on spending my time in the industry in those parts of the value chain, which are very valuable, but because I wanted to understand the technology. And I wanted to be able to communicate it effectively to these stakeholders, right? And there's no way to fake an understanding of your specialization. You need a granular, hands-on, in the weeds understanding of your business in order to really effectively communicate, in my opinion. And so, kind of.
Wait, so you're telling me you're not listing any more solar panels anymore? Is that what you're saying? You're too good for that now. You're too
many
busy?
days.
I'm kidding.
No. Those are the guys that make our industry happen. Like those are the guys, the men and women who are really literally building our energy future, right? Like there's not enough love in me for those people. And there are many days, Andrew, where I wish I was on site. There's such a great feeling of accomplishment when you can flip the switch and turn a power plant on that a year beforehand was just an empty field, right? That sense of accomplishment is hard to get other places. Email, phone calls, PowerPoint presentations, they're a lot less tangible, and they can be a lot less meaningful feeling than that physical sense of accomplishment. So
if they're going to have more projects to work on, they need people like you, building them in bigger and bigger projects. So, but I think what you just said, though, if I can just like pause and narrate what's going on, even that story that you just told of your boots on the ground, tactile origins of solar, I imagine you've told that before to different groups. And I think the story works on a lot of levels too. It's very cool.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, because you get questions from your stakeholders, right? Do you have solar panels on your house? Do you drive an EV, right? And I feel it's extremely important to have the right answers to those questions, and stories like that are exactly what can inculcate trust in what you're doing. I think translating the knowledge that you gain in your specialization and translating that into the language that others use is what's really important, and doing it in a concise and digestible way for who are not in your specialization. I mean, that's extremely important. Everyone has heard engineers or finance guys talk, deeply and passionately about what they're working on or doing, and not understood a word of it, right? And so, how you apply the language of your counterparties to your kind of dialectic it's just so important. I think if you're speaking with a banker, you need to be talking in terms of debt service coverage ratios and returns on invested capital, right? It's the only way you can really effectively communicate on the same ground. It has to be tailored fundamentally. So it's definitely
that's cool.
A story.
That's one of the reasons why I wanted you to come on, because when I worked at Martifer, our offices were pretty open in some ways. And I just remember all these various kinds of people coming through and you having these hallways discussions. And so you could talk to, I remember this vividly, that you could talk to James, the engineer, who is literally like designing the system. And then you could turn around and talk to someone visiting who is a potential client, a local college or university, a president or a dean who doesn't know solar but is interested in putting on it. You are just moving between these groups. And for anyone who's on here and wants to know, as a leader, how do I get better at just navigating all of these different stakeholders? And you just talked about talking to bankers and how you need to talk about particular things. Well, you needed to learn that those were the things that bankers cared about. And secondly, you needed to know what those things meant. You need to know that language as well. So what's your advice to people on how do you move across these different groups authentically?
Yeah. It's a good question, and it's not sort of easily answered, because your two options are: you either personally get that deep into the trenches every day for a while to understand the business that well, but that's not necessarily scalable. And the more complex the business, the less likely that's possible. So then your alternative to that is building a team who has these, very highly specialized capabilities, as well as the ability to communicate. And of course, for scale and for growth, you want to do the latter. There's a lot of benefits to doing the former, and in renewables and solar, you can, whether you can do that when you're building a nuclear power plant or something else, maybe it's different. But I think that the consistent themes are educating your team, right? Educating the folks that will then be telling these stories and communicating with these stakeholders, ensuring that they have all the tools that they need. As a leader, you have to do that. I think facilitation of that team is so important. Of all the certificates that I've gotten, I have probably around 50 certificates in energy hedging, grid management, designing solar projects, financial modeling. The one that is by far the most valuable to me over time has been group facilitation, a certified group facilitator by a UPenn professor, and an intensive kind of 3-week-long, 4-week-long course. And that, more than anything, has been of value, because it teaches how to develop consensus among a group, how to train a group towards an action, right? And that is where you create teams that can then become ambassadors to the business, rather than being siloed, right? That's what's important. But you also have to make sure that they have, again, the data, information, and tools to succeed and to tell the stories properly. If you're not building, if you're not ensuring that your organization follows through on its commitments down to the individual team member, you lose trust. If you don't develop learning processes, lean learning processes, too much process is just as bad as too little process. If you don't develop lean and learning processes, they won't collect organizational data that can then be reviewed and analyzed later by yourself and your teams, and they won't have information and data to learn and grow, and for the organization to learn and grow. And that's terrible. I also think what's really important is structuring organizations for success. In solar, have projects-based organizations. My Stanford coursework on this taught that matrix organizations were the best way to structure project-based organizations, where you end up having two bosses, basically. It's functional, helps you do what you do as best as possible, oversees the quality of your work. And then also an administrative boss, in our case, a project manager, someone who needs things in real time to ensure their projects are successful. Both of those people really need to weigh in on how you're doing, your career path, how you develop. And that structure also enables the proper flow of communication within the organization. It breaks down silos, because the project manager reports up to operations, your engineering manager reports up potentially through engineering, or if it's an accountant, through finance. And so you want to make sure that there's not a single flow of information to your senior team members and then among your senior team members, but among the entire project's team. It's just super, super critical. And I hate to say it, but simple and seemingly straightforward things like having a tactical business plan that's been developed in a top-down, bottom-up way where you're collecting feedback and data from the organization, using that in your planning, using it to develop your strategy, ensuring that team members have buy-in because they've been part of the process. Even if their ideas ultimately aren't incorporated, they're debated, they're discussed openly, and everyone has a role. It's amazing how many organizations don't have a tactical business plan. It can be 50, 100 pages. It doesn't have to be 1,000 pages. And one that is used in decision-making, right? And is used to bring team members along, help them understand the business so that everyone is more clearly aligned. You know, it's sometimes some relatively basic things that get skipped.
We have a great question. Someone asked about specific storytelling tips and great stories, and we will get to that. And one of the things that we will talk about is, as part of great storytelling, is the human element and the emotion element and the authentic element, and which are core to great stories. And so I know your story, Daniel, but the question I have for you is, clearly, you know, solar is a business and it is a dollars and cents business. But I know that for you, it goes far beyond dollars and cents, that you are not in this merely for dollars and cents, or that's not merely, you know, the concern that you think that the solar should be singularly focused on. And so for you, what place does the kind of the emotional, the personal, the non-business elements have in the story that you tell about solar?
Yeah, it's so important. When I'm talking to folks about the value of solar, I will tell them sometimes that my mother died of lung cancer, and the doctor said particulate pollution contributes to lung cancer, right? And how much more personal, relevant, and important can something be, like our technology that is trying to eliminate or dramatically reduce the amount of particulate air pollution that's in the air. And, you know, if something like that doesn't resonate with someone, you know, they don't have a heart. But you're really the core of the culture of many organizations in our industry is built around the fact that in renewables, we are trying to save the world from certain destruction, right? And at the same time, participating in the greatest wealth creation opportunity in our lifetimes, maybe multiple generations. And so, you know, talk about having an extremely deep and meaningful objective, both economic as well as mission driven. It's really hard to beat that. We kind of have it easy in renewables in terms of, building these stories. We often attract folks from other industries that fall in love with the stories as we did joining the industry. And then the task as a business is to capture that enthusiasm, capture that passion, and to harness it to develop value. You know, I hate to give away any secrets, but when I'm interviewing folks, and I've hired about 1,000 folks in renewables over the last 15 years, my organizations have. When I'm interviewing folks, the most important question is right in the middle, as nonchalantly as possible. You know, do you have any moral or ethical reason for wanting to be in this industry, or wanting this job, for being in this industry? And a lot of people say, no, it's growing, it's exciting. You know, this is a good job, this is a good career path, and that's fine. But I tend to hire folks who say, yes, I believe that this is a moral and ethical imperative, and I want to contribute to its success, because I have consistently found time and time again that those folks stay at their desks until 10 o'clock. They're working weekends to try to solve solutions to problems. And we've had, growing this industry, lots and lots of problems. And so, you know, that is, it's not even ancillary to what we do in many organizations in our space. It's kind of the core that drives these teams, which is one of the things I love about it.
This touches on a hypothesis that I often introduce to students, is that I think there's often a perception that the business world isn't a place for the personal, you know, that the business world is a place where you need to be objective, that emotions aren't involved. But I think the reality is far different. And I don't think we see in fact, a lot of these amazing organizations or products or services that we use are they persuade us based on emotion. And so I often think a lot of people are reluctant, oh, I have a business presentation coming, or I'm leading my team next week. I think they're reluctant to bring in the personal, that they're reluctant to bring in the emotional. And one of the things I want to do is just really push people to say that people hang on those things. That's what people connect with. And also what we'll say later is, we'll get it later, that's what people will help them remember what you're saying, because it has a human element component. And I can't say that strongly enough.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, to me, a huge accelerant. I call it the push-pull of renewables. You have the pull of the economic value. Solar is now the lowest cost form of power in the history of humanity. That's what International Renewable Energy Agency reported a few months ago. So that's the pull. But the push is also that you're doing the right moral and ethical thing, right? And so that's why I think solar has seen so much more growth than any analyst ever expected. Going back even a few years, analysts underpredicted where we are today, sometimes by half or more. And so just this huge discounting of what we've actually been able to achieve. And I think it is that push and pull creates that additional acceleration towards the goal of this transition we're doing to renewables. In my real estate business, I think that what gets folks so excited is not the raw economics. We take these historic estates, often built in the 1900s, often owned by the kind of 0.1% of folks. Last one was owned by George Westinghouse. We have a property that was owned by Christopher Reeve, and we bring them to the middle class, make them accessible to the middle class for rental in the short-term vacation rental markets. We also package them into investment vehicles through crowdfunding. So you can be 18 years old, and with $1,000, you can own a piece of a mansion estate that historically was absolutely off limits to you as an investment. You would have needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to have a deposit, right? Or to stay at, right? And so it's the economics of our business are really exciting. We can offer stays for less per person than folks would pay for a group of 15 or 20 for 5 Holiday Inn rooms. But that's not really what gets people excited. That's great, and it leads to lots of renters. But what gets people excited about the business is we are democratizing what has historically been some of the most exclusive assets on earth, right? And so it really is the emotional, the social good element of what we're doing, and the returns are phenomenal. But I think what really kind of clicks is the emotion, is the emotional piece, right? I was a middle class kid. I drove by these properties and never set foot in them. And now I know, thinking, well, now the next generation of folks, they'll see them, they'll have spent time there. It's very emotional, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think what you just said, so I'm going to pull up, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to talk about 5 simple steps or tips for thinking about storytelling. And one of the challenges of this is that there are probably 30 different ways you can think about storytelling. And so these are by no means exhaustive. But I think personally that these are the easiest places to begin. I think for most of us, when we hear about storytelling in the business context or in leadership, we say, "Oh, that's nice. I'd love to tell a story, but I need people to get this information." And so what I want to do is give you a couple tips for thinking about, actually, the story doesn't have to be this elaborate Disney animated film. It just needs to be compelling and coherent and organized in a particular way. So these tips are merely places to begin. And then Daniel is going to sort of jump in with his ideas about his own experience with these. So the first one, and this comes from Nancy, this comes from Nancy Duarte. And if any of you are really into communication and want to learn more about it, you have to go check out Nancy Duarte from Duarte Communications. She helped Al Gore create and design and do his famous An Inconvenient Truth presentation. She helped Steve Jobs with all of his presentations and Apple, and she's in Silicon Valley. She is the go-to person for presentations. And probably her biggest point that she says is that what a story must be is you must explain to people what is the current situation and what could it be. And the idea, and Daniel kind of just did it with his story, is Daniel saying, currently, no one has the opportunity to own or be part of these huge mansions. Or, and for solar, it might be, you know, currently, here's where things are with solar. And then what often people do is they say, they might get the what is part. They'll say, here's where things are currently, and here's what we should do. But what they forget to do is do the what could be. So it's, you know, here's how things are, and here's what we should do. And if we do that, this is what life would look like. And essentially what you're doing in the screenwriting business is called world building. You are saying, here's a world that we could live in. And that's so key. So these parts, this what is and what could be, is a really helpful place to begin, especially because a lot of us are thinking, I have so many things I want to say. I don't even know what I want to say to them. Daniel, does this framework sound sort of familiar to how you think about communicating?
Yeah, and absolutely. And in renewables, it's such an easy story again for us because we're trying to create a cleaner, safer world. Yeah, I use the comparison, what would New York City be like if it had zero tailpipe emissions in that future world, and you enjoyed Times Square with no, you know, tailpipe emissions? It would be amazing, right? That would be phenomenal. No question, that's a good thing. How do we get there, right? And how do we have cars that if we leave them in our garage and leave them on, they don't kill us and the whole family? You know, that's obviously a place we want to be. How do we get there? So couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And the other thing I think that our stories must do is really, humans can only process one big idea. This is my theory. This comes from Tim Pollard at Erasium Communications. And so if you're wondering, I'd ask any of you to think of a presentation that you absolutely love. And how much of it do you remember? And even though you really love this thing, you likely only remember one or two things. And so what we do as presenters or communicators or leaders is we say, they need to know all of these things. Everything is important. And what I would say to everyone is, you might want them to know all these things, but there's no way they're going to remember them. Basically, because we know that how humans process information is they really just cannot handle too many things, especially if those things are new. So what you must figure out with your story is, what is the one big idea that you want to land? And you should make sure that throughout, in the beginning and in the middle and at the end, you're making sure that you're either repeating or developing that idea for the reader or the listener. What I'm trying to say is, you don't want your one big idea to land one time, that you want it to be repeated throughout, and because people also have just terrible memories. And so the idea is always like, at the end of this presentation that you're about to give, what is the one thing that you want people to remember? That now should be the thread that holds your whole story together. Daniel, I'm interested in your thoughts.
What I say to my teams is, it wasn't that many generations ago that our ancestors were swinging from trees. So try to simplify things as much as you possibly can, right? Yeah. And drive to exactly what you said, the one outcome that you want in a given circumstance, process, etc. Yeah, spot on.
And interestingly, I would almost argue, to flip it, is that when I hear an incredible presentation that's really well organized and has one big idea, it's as if I say to the person, thank you, that you did all this work for me. Meaning, I know you had lots of things you wanted to say, and you could have said many different things. And this is almost the way I think about it with my students, is when I say, often when we communicate with people, we're just saying, like, here's a lot of things. You figure out which is important and how these things are related. And our job as leaders is to do all the work and to figure out, if I only have one big thing I can say to them, which is the case, what is that thing going to be? It's do the work, right? Do the work for the reader. Okay. The next thing I think is really key is I believe, and this is just a hypothesis, that a lot of us think that we're not allowed to be ourselves, that we're not allowed to, like Daniel's example earlier, bringing, the tragic story of his mother into his work. And I can't say enough that this is what relationships are built on, and that when you share something personal, people are more likely to trust you. And that this is literally how relationships are built, is on being vulnerable. And often in the business world, and especially with leaders, you're tempted to always have a success story. I can't tell the story to my team about how I messed up, but I can't say enough that, and obviously you have to select the right story, right? But that when you show vulnerability, when you show the idea that I didn't know something, I got it wrong, and then I did this, you're now encouraging your team to be open with you. Daniel, you were talking about transparency. And the other thing that I think people try to do as leaders and as communicators, and especially so with storytelling, is you have to find your own style. That Steve Jobs had a very particular communication style. He was narrative driven. He communicated in a really accessible way, and he kind of had this plain folksy quality to him that belied a very complex thinking and strategy behind it. And this was his style. And I guess my point to everybody is just that you really have to find your own comfortable style, and it might take some time to get there. And this is what I found in teaching, that I have to be me in front of the class. I can't be someone else for an hour and a half. It just won't work.
Yeah, absolutely. It took me a long time when I was younger. When we worked together at Martifer, I was barely 30 years old. And it took me a long time to accept this and to start incorporating failure as a, top priority topic, right? You need to meet on your failures. You need to disclose your failures. When a board asks me, or when someone asks me, Daniel, what value do you bring, right, to an organization as a leader? Often my first example is, I have been in solar for 15 years, solving problems, some of which I caused, right? It's like I hired roofers to do a solar project 13, 14 years ago. That was a terrible idea. That was my idea, right? And so you have to, if you don't admit your failures, you can't demonstrate that you understand and know how to accept them and solve them, right? So important.
I love that story too, because it's so tactile and visual. Roofers, that's a great story. I'm sure that goes over well. I bet you get some laughs when you tell that story. That's cool.
Yeah, that was
That's awesome. The next one is use the unexpected to keep them in their seats. And so this might not apply to everything, but one of the reasons why stories are so sticky and so addictive is that we often, really compelling stories keep us going, what is going to happen next? And so I think this is really effective in particular situations, but one of the ways to think about this is, I'm giving a particular kind of presentation, or I'm doing the classic all hands meeting for my team this year. One way to think about it is, what do they expect my first line to be when I open up this presentation? What is the classic leader opener, and how might I open completely differently? How might I break the pattern? And this is another thing of really good storytelling, is you break the pattern of what everybody expects. Steve Jobs' commencement speech, famous, Stanford, 2006, I think, he opens up by saying, I did not graduate from college. Right? And he's giving this commencement speech at Stanford, not what everybody thought. And so that's just one little example. And again, the idea of this is not use this in every story that you do, but can you build this into your story? Maybe you ask a question at the very beginning and you don't answer it, and you say, by the end of this presentation, we'll have answered this question that I just asked. Another example of legendary excellent use of this is TED Talks. TED Talks always open up and you're kind of going, where is this headed? Where is this story by an MIT professor about a bumblebee? Where is it going? And so this is how you keep people engaged and activated in your story, because they must know what happens next. Nobody is wondering what happens next on a PowerPoint slide with 8 bullet points and 3 bar charts that you can't read. Like there's no mystery except what does this all mean, right? So Daniel, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. You can never underestimate the value of drama, right? I mean, this is why Hollywood exists. And I actually like to throw, from a more mundane business perspective, I like to throw in here, for example, funny stories in business. That's not necessarily common to be lighthearted about, topics involving tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Or also surprising folks with stories about your failures. Not a common thing to do when someone expresses a concern or fear, to respond and say, well, let me tell you about the time that I really messed that up, but on the flip side, it does help engender trust, and it is an effective means of communication, but it's not what it is your traditional 8 bullet point PowerPoint presentation. So yeah, ton of value there too, Andrew.
Excuse me, what you brought up was interesting, because you said about, I think this can map on to the be vulnerable, be human idea too. And so if you tell an incredible story about, like you could perhaps sell your roofer story even more, there I was, I had spent X amount of dollars and these guys were on a roof and they were not putting solar on this roof. What did Daniel do? Right? Like, now I want to know, like, how did you handle it? What did you do? Did you pay, et cetera? And so this is what keeps people going. And obviously you're going to land the plane of that story with some big idea that it's linking to, it's not merely about that. So, so these are the 4 big ideas of how to think about storytelling. 4 quick tips, little tricks. So you've got a presentation next week and you might think, all right, what do these people currently know? What am I suggesting to them? And what vision of this solution-based future would move them, would compel them? And I imagine, Daniel, in solar, when you're talking to various stakeholders, maybe community groups who are concerned, what would my neighborhood look like if I'm driving and in this land that used to be open is now full of these, panels? You have to tell them a different vision of what their future community would look like, I imagine.
Yeah, there's again a lot of fear when it comes to new technologies, and you have to address that head on. You can't leave it unresolved, undiscussed, unaddressed. That's how organizations, projects end up failing. And so you have to show them the counterpoint. There are problems. No industry or product or service has 0 problems. There will always be issues, things you don't like, things that aren't ideal. And in solar, solar takes up land, it sits on rooftops. Some people don't love the way it looks. But what is the alternative? The alternative is dirtier air, dirtier water that literally kills hundreds of thousands of people. And to me, solar looks like, here's an intelligent community that's making good choices. But that took me a while to get to that place. And so you have to help bring folks along, explain the many benefits, which are powerful. They're economic. Do you want lower cost of power? Of course I do. I always want less cost in my life. Do you want cleaner air? Of course I do, right? So you have to counterpoint the challenges and the fears, and again, bringing in all these elements that you've discussed here today. These are all ways to do that.
Okay, cool. So we have about 8 minutes. If you'd like to ask Daniel or me a question, please do. I'm also going to put in the chat, JJ asked about Nancy Duarte and has she written a book? And the answer is yes. She's written many books and all of them are excellent. She's written books about presenting data in a storytelling format. She's written books about presentations. So I put the link there. That's a great place to start. If anyone has any questions in the Q&A about solar, about the renewable industry, about Daniel's work, about leadership, communication, we've kind of covered a lot of things. We're all ears for your questions.
I would add, Andrew, to your book recommendations, my favorite management textbook, when I first started managing a large team at Martifer, at one point we were managing around 1,000 subcontractors and laborers at our projects across 17 states as an organization. So I started reading every management book I could get my hands on at 30 something years old. And the one that I ended up loving the best, I ended up finding some years later, was Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull.
Okay.
He was the founder of Pixar. Yeah, phenomenal book. Disney bought Pixar and ended up making him the CEO of the much larger Disney organization. Just an amazing book about the importance of communication in organizations, how effective communication is engendered. That's where the safe spaces concept is really well explained. Just a killer book. And I actually had no idea it was going to be a management book when I first picked it up. So it's got a picture of Buzz Lightyear on the cover. So I was surprised to find that I felt it was the best business management text that was out there.
That's very cool. Did you say Edwin Catmull? Is that who it's by?
I think so.
By? Okay.
Catmull. Yeah. Catmull is the last name. I think it was Ed.
Okay, great. I just put that in the chat. Oh yeah, Daniel, someone asked about the group facilitation course that you took at Stanford.
Yeah, that was actually a UPenn professor, and the organization was called Training for Change, and I believe they're still around. Phenomenal work. We had to do this training in Canada because a lot of international foreign nationals, some of these folks were basically, nonviolent rebels and resistors in foreign national governments, and they were not allowed into the United States. And so we had to go to Canada to have this training of these global leaders on how to help facilitate groups for action. And it was just absolutely fascinating, and by far the most valuable certification course I've ever done. Amazing.
Okay, so I will try to identify that link. It's UPenn Training for Change. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. You got it.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, this has been. I really appreciate all the attendees. Thanks for your comments, for your questions. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on today. I'm personally excited because this sounds funny. Climate change is I think about it daily. It's an existential issue. I think about it for our future. And this sounds ridiculous, but I swear I feel better knowing people like you are working on it. I truly mean that because I know that you care so much about it. And so, really appreciate you coming on today and talking about all your insights and your experiences. So thank you.
No, thank you, Andrew. A pleasure. And, I love what you do here in helping folks become more effective at what they do. I found communication to be one of the greatest failure points within organizations, right? The development of silos and internal cultures that can be counterproductive. And so I love what you're doing. Keep it up, man.
Great. Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you for coming today. And we hope to see you at next month's Effective Leadership Series. Take care.